The bounty hunters slammed Deneb's head on the cantina table, shoving a blaster against his temple. "Time's up. You're a dead alien if the Zorgans don't get that formula." Deneb and his friend Zircon were supposed to be enjoying drinks in this bustling spaceport, but Deneb's double-crossed trade deal with the Zorgans had come back to bite him. The pounding music and rowdy patrons provided little cover from the hunters cornering their booth, sent by the Zorgans to collect or kill. Deneb shook as the cold gun barrel pressed his blue scales. "I told those Zorgan slugs, I don't have the quantum entanglement formula they want. It's not mine to give. They took my cargo, but I got nothing." "They'll take your life if you don't pay up." The pig-faced bounty hunter tightened his grip. "Maybe they'll take your family too." Zircon gripped his own blaster under the table, ready to fight, but they were outgunned and the Zorgons owned the authorities. Deneb's only hope was to comply. Unless he found someone crazy enough to outmaneuver the Zorgans, someone with a reputation for getting things done against impossible odds. Zircon leaned in to whisper, "I know a guy, he could help." "Who?" Deneb said. "The Zorgons run everything. Their empire spans the galaxy. Who's insane enough to fight them?" "There's one species that loves a suicidal challenge." Zircon's eyes glinted. "The humans." "Humans?" Deneb scoffed. "They just discovered spaceflight. What could those crazy Terrans possibly do?" Zircon chuckled, remembering the stories. "They're so crazy they might be exactly what we need. Have you heard of Anthony Wells?" Deneb shook his head slowly, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Anthony Wells? Never heard of him. Is he some kind of trader or diplomat?" Zircon leaned back in the booth, a mysterious smile playing across his face. He took a long swig of his drink before replying. "Not exactly. Anthony Wells is a human problem solver, a fixer. He's got a knack for getting into and out of tight spots, and he's not afraid to bend the rules to get the job done." Deneb frowned, skepticism etched in his features. He glanced nervously at the bounty hunters still looming over their table. "But how can one human possibly help me against the Zorgans? They have an entire crime syndicate backing them up." Zircon took another sip of his drink, savoring the moment. He seemed to be enjoying Deneb's incredulity. "Let me tell you a story," he said, setting his glass down. "A few years back, I was in a similar situation. A rival corporation had stolen my designs for a new type of faster-than-light engine. They were going to sell it to the highest bidder, and I was going to be ruined. That's when I met Anthony." Deneb leaned in, his curiosity piqued despite the dire circumstances. "What did he do?" Zircon grinned, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "He infiltrated the rival corporation, posing as a potential buyer. He gained their trust, got access to their systems, and not only retrieved my stolen designs, but also exposed their illegal activities to the authorities. They were shut down, and I got my designs back, all thanks to Anthony's clever maneuvering." Deneb's eyes widened, impressed by the tale. "That's incredible, but how did he manage to fool them? Surely they would have recognized a human." Zircon chuckled, shaking his head. "That's the thing about humans. They're master infiltrators. They can blend in anywhere, adapt to any situation. And Anthony, he's got a silver tongue. He can talk his way into or out of anything." Deneb sat back, his mind reeling from the possibilities Zircon presented. He rubbed his chin, considering Anthony Wells and his unorthodox methods. "So, you really think this human could help me get out of this mess with the Zorgans? How would he even begin to approach a situation like this?" Zircon took a long sip from his glass, savoring the drink before setting it back down on the table. He leaned in, his voice lowering conspiratorially. "Well, knowing Anthony, the first thing he'd do is gather intel on the Zorgans. He'd dig deep, find out who their top dogs are, what makes them tick, what their weaknesses are. He'd figure out what they really want, beyond just your cargo and that formula." Deneb nodded, following Zircon's train of thought. "Okay, so he'd do his homework, but then what? How would he actually deal with them?" Zircon shrugged, a smirk playing on his lips. "That's the thing with Anthony. His plans are always unconventional, unpredictable. He might go undercover, pose as a rival gang member looking to make a deal, Or he might play the part of a disgruntled Zorgon employee, ready to spill secrets. Hell, he might even pretend to be a long-lost relative of the Zorgon boss. The man's a master of disguise and deception. Deneb frowned, still not entirely convinced. But how would any of that actually help me get my cargo back and keep my family's business safe? Zircon leaned in further, his eyes glinting with excitement. Once Anthony's on the inside, that's when the real magic happens. He'd start planting seeds of doubt, creating conflicts between the Zorgons. He'd exploit their greed, get them pointing fingers at each other. If he's really clever, he might even find a way to get them to reveal their own illegal activities to the authorities. Deneb's eyes widened as he started to see the bigger picture. So the Zorgons would be too busy fighting each other and fending off the law to worry about my cargo or the formula? Zircon nodded, a confident grin spreading across his face. Exactly. They'd be so caught up in their own mess they'd forget all about you, and that's when you make your move, get your stuff back, and get the hell out of Dodge. A glimmer of hope sparked in Deneb's eyes. You really think he could pull something like that off? It sounds risky. Zircon sat back, his confidence unwavering. I've seen Anthony do it before. The humans have a saying, divide and conquer. And believe me, Anthony Wells is a master at it. If anyone can outmaneuver the Zorgons, it's him. Deneb took a deep breath, the weight of his situation still heavy on his shoulders. But for the first time since the bounty hunters had cornered him, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this crazy human could be his ticket out of this nightmare. Deneb took the translucent card from Zircon's outstretched hand, flipping it over to examine both sides. The card was blank except for a single line of text, a comm frequency. Zircon leaned back in the booth, his arms crossed. That's all you need, just send a message to that frequency, and Anthony will get in touch. Deneb nodded, slipping the card into his pocket. He glanced around the crowded cantina, suddenly feeling exposed. The bounty hunters were still lurking nearby, their eyes boring into him. I need to get out of here, Deneb said, his voice low and urgent. If I stay any longer, those goons are going to get impatient. Zircon drained the last of his drink and stood up. Come on, I know a back way out of here. We can slip away without them noticing. Deneb followed Zircon through the throng of patrons, keeping his head down. They wove their way through the crowd, the pounding music and raucous laughter providing cover for their escape. As they neared the back of the cantina, Zircon suddenly grabbed Deneb's arm, pulling him into a narrow alcove. Deneb opened his mouth to protest, but Zircon held a finger to his lips, silencing him. Two of the bounty hunters stalked past, their eyes scanning the crowd. Deneb held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. After a tense moment, the hunters moved on, disappearing into the sea of bodies. Zircon peeked out from the alcove, then motioned for Deneb to follow. They slipped through a nondescript door, emerging into a dimly lit alley behind the cantina. Deneb let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Thanks, he said, his voice shaky. I owe you one. Zircon waved off the thanks. Just get in touch with Anthony. He's your best shot at getting out of this mess. Deneb nodded, his hand going to the pocket where he'd stashed the card. I will, as soon as I'm somewhere safe. Zircon clapped him on the shoulder. Good luck, and remember what I said. Be honest with Anthony. He's your ally, but only as long as you play straight with him. With that, Zircon turned and melted into the shadows of the alley, leaving Deneb alone with his thoughts and the weight of the card in his pocket. Deneb took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He had no idea what working with a human would entail, but he knew it was his only chance. He pulled out his comm device, his fingers hovering over the keys. A moment of hesitation gripped him. Was he really about to put his fate in the hands of an alien he'd never met, a species that had only just ventured into the galactic stage? But then he thought of his family, of the business he'd built from nothing. He thought of the Zorgons and their threats, the bounty hunters at his heels. He had no choice. With a determined set to his jaw, Deneb input the frequency from the card and hit send. The die was cast. There was no turning back now. The comm device beeped, indicating the message had been sent. Now all Deneb could do was wait for a reply, and hope that this Anthony Wells was as good as Zircon claimed. He slipped the device back into his pocket and started down the alley, his mind racing with possibilities and fears. The unknown stretched before him, vast and daunting. But beneath the fear, a small spark of hope flickered to life. Maybe, just maybe, this crazy plan would work. Maybe the human could outsmart the Zorgans and save Deneb's skin. It was a slim chance, but it was all he had, and right now slim was better than none. Deneb quickened his pace, the echoes of his footsteps bouncing off the alley walls. He had preparations to make and precautions to take. If he was going to work with a human, he needed to be ready for anything. Because one thing was for sure, when it came to humans, especially one like Anthony Wells, the only thing you could expect was the unexpected. Deneb took a shaky breath, his heart racing as he gripped the encrypted communicator. The device felt foreign and dangerous in his hands, a direct line to a shadowy human he'd never met. But desperation drove him forward, the weight of his family's livelihood pushing him to take this leap of faith. It all started with a trade deal, Deneb began, his voice tight with tension. I was supposed to deliver a shipment of rare minerals to the Zorgans, but when I arrived, they claimed the goods were subpar. They took the whole cargo and refused to pay. He paused, his free hand clenching into a fist. I tried to reason with them, to prove the quality of the minerals, but they wouldn't listen. They threatened me, said I owed them now, that if I didn't deliver something of equal value, they'd come after me, after my family. Deneb's voice cracked, the fear and frustration bleeding through. They want a formula, a chemical compound used in quantum entanglement, but it's not mine to give. It belongs to my business partner, and he's off-world. I don't have access to it. He took another breath, steadying himself. That's when the bounty hunters started showing up. The Zorgon sent them to collect, said my time was running out. I didn't know what to do, but then a friend told me about you, said you were the man to call when things got desperate. Deneb's grip tightened on the communicator, his knuckles pale. I need your help, Mr. Wells. I need you to get the Zorgans off my back, to save my cargo and my family. I don't know how you'll do it, but I was told you're the best. He fell silent, waiting with bated breath for the human's response. The seconds ticked by, each one an eternity. Finally, Anthony's voice crackled through the speaker. I understand your situation, Deneb, and I'm willing to help, but you need to understand that my methods are not always conventional. I operate in the shadows, outside the normal channels. Deneb nodded, then realized Anthony couldn't see him. I understand. I'm prepared to do whatever it takes. I just need this nightmare to be over. Good, Anthony said, his tone businesslike. Then here's what we're going to do. First, I need you to lay low. Find a safe place to hide out, somewhere the Zorgons won't think to look. Can you do that? Deneb thought for a moment. Yes, I have a place in mind. A small moon in the outer rim used for refueling. I have a contact there. He can help me stay off the grid. Perfect, Anthony said. Go there and wait for my signal. In the meantime, I'll start digging into the Zorgans, see what I can find out about their operation. I'll also work on locating your cargo, see if we can't get that back in the process. Deneb felt a surge of hope, the first he'd had in weeks. Thank you, Mr. Wells. I don't know how to repay you. Let's worry about that later, Anthony said, his voice tinged with amusement. For now, just focus on staying alive. Leave the rest to me. With that, the line went dead, the sudden silence deafening. Deneb stared at the communicator, his mind reeling. He was really doing this, putting his trust in a human he'd never even seen. But what choice did he have? The Zorgans were closing in, his options dwindling by the day. Anthony Wells was his last hope, a desperate gambit in a game he never wanted to play. Deneb pocketed the communicator, his jaw set with determination. It was time to disappear, to buy Anthony the time he needed to work his magic. He turned to Zircon, who'd been watching the exchange with a mix of curiosity and concern. Thank you, my friend. I owe you more than I can say. Zircon waved off the thanks. Just stay safe out there and trust Anthony. He's never let me down before. Deneb nodded, his resolve hardening. I will. And when this is all over, drinks are on me. With a final clasp of Zircon's shoulder, Deneb turned and melted into the shadows of the alley. He had a long journey ahead of him and no time to waste. Anthony Wells was on the case now, and for the first time in a long time, Deneb allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd make it out of this mess alive. Deneb took a shaky breath, his heart racing as he gripped the encrypted communicator. The device felt foreign and dangerous in his hands, a direct line to a shadowy human he'd never met. But desperation drove him forward, the weight of his family's livelihood pushing him to take this leap of faith. It all started with a trade deal, Deneb began, his voice tight with tension. I was supposed to deliver a shipment of rare minerals to the Zorgons, but when I arrived, they claimed the goods were subpar. They took the whole cargo and refused to pay. He paused, his free hand clenching into a fist. I tried to reason with them, to prove the quality of the minerals. But they wouldn't listen. They threatened me, said I owed them now, that if I didn't deliver something of equal value, they'd come after me, after my family. Deneb's voice cracked, the fear and frustration bleeding through. They want a formula, a chemical compound used in quantum entanglement, but it's not mine to give. It belongs to my business partner, and he's off-world. I don't have access to it. He took another breath, steadying himself. That's when the bounty hunters started showing up. The Zorgon sent them to collect, said my time was running out. I didn't know what to do. But then a friend told me about you, said you were the man to call when things got desperate. Deneb's grip tightened on the communicator, his knuckles pale. I need your help, Mr. Wells. I need you to get the Zorgons off my back, to save my cargo and my family. I don't know how you'll do it, but I was told you're the best. He fell silent, waiting with bated breath for the human's response. The seconds ticked by, each one an eternity. Finally, Anthony's voice crackled through the speaker. I understand your situation, Deneb, and I'm willing to help, but you need to understand that my methods are not always conventional. I operate in the shadows, outside the normal channels. Deneb nodded, then realized Anthony couldn't see him. I understand. I'm prepared to do whatever it takes. I just need this nightmare to be over. Anthony chuckled, a hint of mischief in his tone. I've dealt with the Zorgons before. I know their weaknesses. Let's just say I convinced them it was in their best interest to play fair. I had some leverage, information they didn't want getting out. Hope surged in Deneb's chest. You have? What did you do? That's not important right now, Anthony said. What matters is getting your cargo back and ensuring your family's safety. I can help you, but it won't be easy. The Zorgons are stubborn. They don't like admitting defeat. We'll need to outsmart them at their own game. Deneb swallowed hard. What do you need me to do? For now, nothing, Anthony said calmly. I need to do some reconnaissance, gather intel. I have contacts in the Zorgon underworld who owe me favors. I'll reach out to them, see what I can learn. In the meantime, go about your business as usual. Don't let on that anything is amiss. Relief washed over Deneb. I understand. Thank you, Anthony. I don't know what I would have done without you. Anthony laughed warmly. Don't thank me yet. We've still got a lot of work to do, but don't worry, we'll get through this. I've never met a problem I couldn't solve, especially when it comes to dealing with scum like the Zorgons. Deneb felt a flicker of hope, a light in the darkness that had consumed his life. Maybe, just maybe, he had a chance. With Anthony Wells on his side, anything seemed possible. He gripped the communicator tightly as if it were a lifeline. In a way it was. It was his connection to the one man who could save him from this nightmare. I'll be waiting for your signal, Deneb said, his voice steadier now. Whatever you need, I'll be ready. Good, Anthony said. Stay sharp, Deneb. I'll be in touch soon. The line went dead, the sudden silence almost deafening. Deneb stared at the communicator, his mind reeling. He was really doing this. He was putting his life, his family's future, in the hands of a human he'd never met. It was a gamble, a desperate roll of the dice. But what choice did he have? The Zorgons had him cornered, his options dwindling by the day. Anthony Wells was his last hope, his only chance at salvation. Deneb sank back in his chair, the weight of the conversation with Anthony Wells settling over him. A mix of emotions swirled in his chest, relief, gratitude, but also a twinge of uncertainty. He glanced at Zircon, who had been listening quietly the whole time. "Do you think he can really do it?" Deneb asked, his voice tight with worry. "Take on the Zorgons and win?" Zircon smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. He sipped his drink, the ice clinking against the glass. "If anyone can, it's Anthony. I've seen him pull off the impossible before, like the time he negotiated a peace treaty between the Krelans and the Vaxians." Deneb's eyes widened, his brows shooting up in surprise. The Krelans and the Vaxians, but they've been at war for centuries. How did he manage that? Zircon leaned back, crossing his legs. It wasn't easy. Both sides were stubborn, convinced that they were in the right. They'd been fighting for so long they didn't even remember what started the conflict. But Anthony, he has a way of getting people to see things from a different perspective. Deneb leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. What did he do? He showed them that they had more to gain by working together than by fighting each other, Zircon said. He found resources they both needed, trade routes they could share. He even uncovered a common enemy they didn't know they had. In the end, they realized that their hatred for each other was holding them back. Deneb nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. He found common ground, something they could both agree on. Zircon snapped his fingers, pointing at Deneb. Exactly. And that's what he'll do with the Zorgons. He'll find a way to make them see that it's in their best interest to return your cargo and leave your family alone. Deneb took a deep breath, feeling a surge of hope, but it was tempered by the fear of what could happen if Anthony failed. I hope you're right. I don't know what I'd do if I lost my family's business. It's all we have. Zircon reached across the table, placing a hand on Deneb's shoulder. His grip was firm, reassuring. Trust in Anthony. He's never let me down, and he won't let you down either. The humans, they have a way of coming through when you need them most. Deneb looked into Zircon's eyes, searching for any hint of doubt. But all he saw was conviction, a steadfast belief in Anthony's abilities. It was contagious, and Deneb felt his own resolve strengthening. Okay, he said, nodding. I'll trust him. I don't have any other choice. Zircon grinned, patting Deneb's shoulder before withdrawing his hand. Good, now let's finish these drinks. We've got some planning to do. Deneb picked up his glass, the amber liquid sloshing against the sides. He took a sip, the burn of the alcohol warming his throat. It was a small comfort, a momentary distraction from the chaos of his life. But as he sat there, listening to Zircon outline the next steps, Deneb couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. For better or for worse, his fate was now tied to Anthony Wells and his unconventional methods. He just hoped that Zircon's faith in the human was not misplaced, because if it was, Deneb had a feeling that not even the farthest reaches of the galaxy would be far enough to escape the Zorgon's wrath. Deneb leaned in closer, his eyes wide with anticipation. He gripped his drink tightly, the glass slick with condensation. So what happened next? How did they escape? Zircon grinned, relishing the chance to recount one of Anthony's most daring exploits. He took another swig of his drink, the ice clinking against the glass. Well, once Anthony had disabled the Curran's weapons and comms, he and the diplomat didn't waste any time. They bolted out of the room, racing down the corridors of the compound. Zircon's hands flew through the air, painting a vivid picture. Anthony had memorized the layout of the place, so he knew exactly where to go. They dodged patrols, ducked into alcoves to avoid detection. All the while, Anthony was keeping an eye out for their escape route. Deneb nodded, picturing the scene in his mind. He could almost feel the adrenaline, the thrill of the escape. Finally, they reached the hangar bay. Zircon continued, his voice rising with excitement. And there it was, a sleek Karen fighter just waiting for them. Anthony hot-wired the ignition, and they jumped in, the diplomat strapping in behind him. Zircon paused, letting the suspense build. Deneb leaned forward, almost spilling his drink. But just as they were about to take off, a group of Karens burst into the hangar, weapons drawn. Anthony gunned the engines, the ship roaring to life. Blaster bolts pinged off the hull as they lifted off, the Karens firing frantically to stop them. Zircon mimed the action, his hands gripping an imaginary control yoke. Anthony jinked and weaved, dodging the incoming fire. The diplomat hung on for dear life as they rocketed out of the hangar, the Karan compound falling away beneath them. Deneb let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. That's incredible. I can't believe they made it out alive. Zircon laughed, leaning back in his seat. Believe it. Anthony's pulled off some crazy stunts in his time, but that one definitely ranks up there. The Venturians were so grateful, they offered him a fortune in reward money. Deneb's eyebrows shot up. Did he take it? Zircon shook his head, a wry smile on his face. Nah, that's not Anthony's style. He told them to donate it to a Venturian charity instead. Said that's what the diplomat would have wanted. Deneb sat back, marveling at the story. The sheer audacity of it, the bravery and skill it must have taken. If Anthony could pull off a rescue like that, maybe he really did stand a chance against the Zorgans. Zircon seemed to read his mind. He leaned in, his expression serious. Listen, Deneb, I know things look bad right now, but if anyone can get you out of this mess, it's Anthony. The man's a miracle worker. Deneb nodded, feeling a renewed sense of hope. 3 cycles wasn't a lot of time, but with Anthony on the case, anything was possible. He raised his glass, clinking it against Zircon's. To Anthony Wells, then, and to pulling off the impossible. Zircon grinned, raising his own glass in return. To Anthony Wells, may his crazy plans never fail. They drank, the liquor burning pleasantly down their throats. Outside, the bustling spaceport went about its business, unaware of the high-stakes game being played in its midst. But in that moment, in that dingy cantina booth, Deneb felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt hope. Deneb sat back in the booth, his eyes wide with wonder. The tales of Anthony's exploits, his unwavering commitment to justice, painted a picture of a man unlike any Deneb had ever known. He sounds like a real hero, Deneb said, shaking his head in amazement. But I can't help but wonder, why does he do it? Why does he risk his life to help others? Zircon smiled, a knowing glint in his eye. He leaned forward, his voice low and sincere. That's just the way humans are. They have this innate sense of justice, of right and wrong. They can't stand by and watch others suffer, even if it means putting themselves in danger. Deneb nodded slowly, the concept sinking in. It was a foreign notion to him, the idea of putting others before oneself. I guess that's what sets them apart from other species. Most of us, we're just looking out for ourselves, for our own interests. That's true, Zircon agreed. But humans, they have this saying, with great power comes great responsibility. They believe that if they have the ability to help, then they have an obligation to do so. Deneb considered this, a newfound respect for humans growing in his mind. All his life he'd been taught to look out for number one, to never stick his neck out for others. But Anthony, and humans like him, they operated on a different code. I never thought of it that way, Deneb admitted. I always assumed humans were just reckless, always rushing into danger without thinking. Zircon laughed, a deep, hearty sound. Oh, they can be reckless, all right. But it's always for a good cause, like the time Anthony helped expose a corrupt Galactic Council member. He knew he was putting a target on his back, but he did it anyway, because it was the right thing to do. Deneb's eyes widened, his interest piqued. He leaned in, eager to hear more. What happened? How did he expose the corruption? Zircon took a long sip of his drink, savoring the memory. He set the glass down, a smirk playing on his lips. He got his hands on some incriminating evidence, Zircon said, his voice low and conspiratorial. Recordings of backroom deals and bribes. He leaked it to the media, along with a detailed report of the council members' misdeeds. Deneb's mouth fell open, shocked by the audacity of it. To take on a council member, one of the most powerful individuals in the galaxy. The story blew up, Zircon continued, his eyes gleaming with pride. And the council had no choice but to remove the member from power and launch a full investigation. Deneb shook his head, marveling at the feat. That's incredible. He took on one of the most powerful individuals in the galaxy, and he won. Zircon nodded, his chest puffing out with pride. That's Anthony for you. He's not afraid to stand up to anyone, no matter how powerful they are. He believes in truth and justice, and he'll fight for it, no matter the cost. Deneb sat back, his mind reeling. He'd always thought of humans as a young, naive species, stumbling their way through the galaxy. But now he saw them in a new light. They were brave, principled, willing to put everything on the line for what they believed in. And Anthony, he was the embodiment of those ideals. A newfound sense of hope bloomed in Deneb's chest. If Anthony could take on the likes of corrupt council members and win, then maybe, just maybe, he stood a chance against the Zorgans. Deneb looked at Zircon, a determined glint in his eye. Tell me more about Anthony's exploits. I want to know everything. Zircon grinned, settling back in his seat. Oh, I've got stories, all right, like the time he infiltrated a Krovian smuggling ring. Zircon's face grew somber, his brow furrowing with concern. He leaned back in the booth, nursing his drink as he spoke. You know, as much as I admire Anthony and the other humans, I can't help but worry about them sometimes. They give so much of themselves, always putting others first. It's like they carry the weight of the galaxy on their shoulders. Deneb nodded, a look of understanding crossing his features. He had seen firsthand the sacrifices Anthony was willing to make, the risks he was prepared to take. It must be a heavy burden, always being the ones to step up and fight for what's right. I can't imagine the toll it must take on them. Zircon sighed, his eyes growing distant as if lost in memory. I've seen it firsthand, the sacrifices they make, the losses they endure. Anthony, he's lost friends, loved ones, even parts of himself in the line of duty, but he keeps going, keeps fighting, because he knows that if he doesn't, who will? Deneb felt a pang of guilt twist in his gut. Here he was, asking for Anthony's help, adding to the weight on the human's shoulders. I never really thought about it like that. I was so focused on my own problems, I didn't consider what it might cost him to help me. Zircon reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on Deneb's arm. He gave a small smile, his eyes softening. Don't beat yourself up about it. Anthony wouldn't have agreed to help if he didn't want to. That's just the kind of person he is. But it's important to remember that even heroes have their limits, their breaking points. Deneb nodded, a new resolve hardening in his eyes. He sat up straighter, his shoulders squaring. You're right. After this is all over, I'm going to find a way to pay it forward, to help others the way Anthony is helping me. It's the least I can do. Zircon raised his glass, a silent toast to their newfound understanding. To Anthony and to all the humans out there fighting for what's right, may they always have the strength to carry on, and may we never forget the sacrifices they make on our behalf. Deneb lifted his own glass, clinking it against Zircon's. The sound rang out in the quiet of the booth, a promise sealed. To Anthony, and to the unsung heroes of the galaxy, may we strive to be more like them, in whatever way we can. As they drank, the liquor burning down their throats, both Deneb and Zircon knew that their lives had been forever changed by their encounter with Anthony Wells and the indomitable human spirit. They may not be able to fight alongside him, but they could carry his message of hope and justice forward in their own small way. And in the end, that may be the greatest tribute they could offer to the man who came to their aid when all seemed lost. Deneb set his empty glass down on the table, a contemplative look on his face. You know, Anthony reminds me of the stories my grandfather used to tell me about the Galactic War, the way the humans fought, the sacrifices they made. It's like history repeating itself. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, And for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.